Welcome to the Nano Entrepreneurship Network podcast, where entrepreneurs who have transitioned ideas into the marketplace share their insights and some of the lessons they've learned while navigating the technology development pathway. I'm Lisa Friedersdorf, Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. Today, I'm joined by Lin, founder and CEO of Flextrapower. Lin, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your company? How did you get started?
I was born in Vietnam. I came to the United States in 2007 to pursue my master in chemical engineering from Columbia University. After that, I was transferred to Stevens Institute of Technology for my Ph.D., also in chemical engineering. During my Ph.D., I was working with graphene nanomaterial. I'm sure that the audience here knows about graphene. At the time, 2010, 2012, graphene was relatively new material, I would say. And then from there, I got bitten by the entrepreneur bug. And that's how I came up with the idea, founding Flextrapower in order to commercialize, in order to further develop, and then bring the graphene material into a product that everyone can potentially use.
So you mentioned that you were bitten by the entrepreneurial bug. Can you talk a little bit about your experience transitioning from an academic scientist to an entrepreneur and CEO? And what bit you? I mean, how did that happen?
I would say throughout my life, I have always been interested in applied science. So after getting my bachelor degree in Vietnam, I was actually have a chance to not only working with one of the best research lab in Vietnam, but then at the same time, I was involving in another project trying to spin off or spin out the technology that we were working on in that particular lab in another startup company. So I would say that I have always been interested in entrepreneur for the past 20 years of my life. But then at that time, I didn't know the word entrepreneur. And then actually, when I was working on my PhD, I was funded by the project that was funded by the US Army, trying to look at the graphene nanomaterial as the next supercapacitor and flexible battery. But at the same time, there are other type of applications that can be applied or that can be applicable with the graphene. And that was when I put on my thinking cap, and then I'm seeing, okay, so this application is good for the US Army. What other application that the civilian can be taking advantage of based on the material? And that was when I was literally spending a lot of time in the lab. I was trying to see, other than the energy storage as a property of the graphene material, what other thing we can look at. And then I stumbled into a very interesting sensing property from the graphene material. And that was when I proposed to the technology transfer office at the university, and then sharing with them the idea that, hey, this could be something new, this could be something very cool, and then why don't we put a patent on it? And up to now, I would say that I'm very proud that I am one of the co-inventor for 5 issue patents, and then we are working on several more as a really the foundation of the IP for the company.
I understand that many small companies in particular have been challenged by the pandemic. Can you discuss your experience? How did you face these challenges?
I would have to agree with you that 2020 has been a very challenging year, not only for mankind at the same time, but also for business. It was a really bad timing for Flextrapower because when we were out and raising additional round of money, we were supposed to close a seed round back in April of this year. However, due to the market crash, we were not able to get the funding round. And then at the time, I have only 2 options. Option number 1 is to shut down the company, and option number 2, to persist. So I was able to get communication mainly with my internal team, and then also my external partner, and then be transparent and then communicative with them on how we see the pandemic, how do we see the future of Flextrapower, And then actually at the time, we were working on the clinical trial that trying to bring the smart insole into the market. So essentially what Flextrapower do before the pandemic, we were developing the connected insole, trying to help diabetic patients. We actually printed our graphene sensor on top of the insole as the most flexible, as the most precise temperature and pressure sensor. So we can continuously monitor the foot health for diabetic patients. So essentially, once we have that data, we would be able to predict any diabetic patient will have the ability to develop the high risk for the foot ulcer. So that was the product we were working on before pandemic. We actually came very close to the FDA application. We were working with 3 hospitals, 2 in the United States and then 1 in Asia, in order to gather a lot of clinical trial data so we would be able to bring the product to the market. However, COVID hit us. Nobody knows it. So during the time, we were not able to conduct the clinical trial. And then, as I was saying before, I was in the mode of persist or die. And that was actually the time when I went back to the whiteboard with my team. And then we were talking with each other. We were seeing what other property of the graphene can actually help humanity, can help people, especially during COVID. So we came up with the idea that we can integrate the graphene material into the mask. And then at that time, within 5 to 6 weeks, we were able to pull it together. We were able to get the first prototype of a reusable mask that employ the graphene filter. So that's how we, I would say, overcome pandemic.
So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about your experience applying for federal funding. And I understand that you've been successful and been awarded some projects with the federal government. Could you describe the impact that this has had on your company?
Sure. The way that I am seeing it, the moment I am thinking about founding the company need to be, as a business, we need money to run. And then the way that I'm seeing it, there are 2 types of money that academic scientists who want to turn to entrepreneur can take advantage of. One is a non-dilutive funding, not only from federal, but also from state, from city, and then even from school. And then the other type of funding, I call that dilutive funding, which is traditional angel investor money, seed funding money, as well as venture capital money for growing the company. So now going back to the first type of funding, back in 2016, we received the first funding from New York City. I was still a Ph.D. student at the time. I was working on the company, obviously on my side, part-time, I would say. The first check that we received was only $10,000 US. But then that was awarded by New York City Economic Development Corporation through the program called Next Top Maker. At the time, $10,000 can go a long way. Really, I spent that amount of funding in order to build the first prototype. And then from that first prototype, I was able to talk to the hospital that has been working with me since 2017. I was able to show that to the potential investor. And then actually from that first amount of funding that was awarded through city, I got my first National Science Foundation SBIR, or Small Business Innovation Research Grant, phase 1 in 2017. So I will say that I would credit almost 100% of the government or the federal funding in order to lay the foundation for the company to be where we are today.
So we often talk with entrepreneurs or small business folks in particular who think back on their experience and can say, you know, if I were going to do this over, I would do it differently. Do you have an example of a strategy or a decision that you made that you would do differently if you had the chance?
I would say that as a entrepreneur or even as a scientist, we have to make mistake in order to grow. But then if you ask me, am I regretting making those mistakes? I wouldn't think so, because the only way that anyone can learn from running the company, from doing the project, is actually by making a mistake. However, I do think that there are several decisions when it involving the team, I might have think about doing it differently. One of the example that is still stick with me today was when COVID hit, and then I was saying before, we are producing the graphene mask. I think that we wait a little too long before deciding our go-to-market strategy. At the time, we were testing our B2C approach, which is business to consumer approach, by setting up the online store while trying to sell the mask in bulk to company and the employee. So we were thinking, are we a B2B company, direct business to business, or B2C company when we are selling directly to consumer? At that time, it took about 5 weeks in order to really see which one is picking up more in terms of traction. And then actually at that time, you know that back in June, July, everybody was working from home. Communication with the team has been super difficult, even though we have Zoom, even though we were talking with each other a lot, but then it is not the same as everyone in the office. With our small team like that, our resources were actually spread too thin across both B2B and B2C. And now, thinking back about it, I made a mistake waiting too long for making that decision. We should have invested fully either on B2C or B2B. And that was actually one of the decisions that I think that I would make differently.
So I have a question about that. How did you ramp up production to be able to distribute in either B2B to businesses or straight to consumer as you just described?
Let me take a step back and then explain why we make the pivot. And then once we have that explanation, it's going to be easier. So initially, before COVID, we were working on the connected insole for diabetic patients. And then we were working a lot with the hospital. So when COVID hit, obviously non-COVID project was put on hold. But then at the same time, when I was talking with all of the doctors who are working with us, they actually suffering from lack of PPE. So at that time, back in April, all of the doctors that I was working with in NYU, Langone Hospital, as well as a few more, as well as Louisiana University Hospital, they will actually suffer from lack of PPE. So the first thing that we did as a company was that I went on to my social network, and then I was actually put on a fundraising campaign. Firstly, we raised 40,000 in total. And then from that, I was able to talk with some mask supplier in China and Vietnam. And then we were able to bring in a lot of masks. We were distributing to New York Presbyterian in New York City. We were distributing to NYU and then several more hospitals right here in New York City. But then that was just like one-time thing. And then after that, I was still talking with my doctors team, and then they were still suffering from PPE shortage. And then also the other thing that I am seeing was that all of the disposable surgical mask is actually not good for the planet. So what can be done better? And then that was actually one of the motivation for us to really go back to the whiteboard and then see how the graphene can potentially play a role developing a reusable filter, replaceable filter in a reusable mask, and then it could be the same or actually better performing compared to the surgical mask.
Can you share your thoughts on working As the boss of a small company, how do you motivate your team, and what sort of makeup do you look for in your team? Is interdisciplinarity important, for instance?
I would say that when the company is young, when the company is less than 10 people, for example, the way that I run the company is actually very similar to the way that if I were staying in academic and then running a lab and then acting as a PI, I would say. So the way that I am seeing it, I was super lucky that my thesis advisor in Columbia, as well as in Stephen, is a very visionary PI. So I learned a lot from them, not only from the scientific approach, from the methodology on how to approach the experiment, but also how to motivate people. So I would like to apply those learning and then working with the team or building the team that I want in order to achieve the vision of the company that I early on set out. So one of the experience that I would like to share with younger entrepreneur, for example, would be setting out the mission, vision, and value for the company. So the mission and the vision of the company should be really big enough, because no one wants to come in early stage company to work on a project. They need to feel as a part of the bigger vision. And then I am in the past 3 years working and leading Flextrapower. I found out that the best way to motivate people is actually by aligning interests. It is even more so right now during COVID when everybody is working from home. So really, if we are going in the same direction, everybody can be sitting at home, but then still contributing to the larger vision, contributing to the mission of the company.
So Lynn, I really want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today. And for those of you listening, if you're interested in joining the Nanotechnology Entrepreneurship Network, go to nano.gov/Nano Entrepreneurship Network or email nen@nnco.nano.gov.